4 astronauts are about to fly farther from Earth than any human crew in history. They will not land on the moon. They will not plant a flag. They will not collect a single rock. And yet, what they accomplish over 10 days in deep space may matter more than any lunar landing since Apollo. Artemis II is not a return to the moon. It is a proof that returning to the moon is no longer just a plan on paper. In a world where China is building its own crude lunar spacecraft, where the International Space Station faces retirement, and where 53 years have passed since a human last saw the moon up close, this single flyby mission carries strategic weight that most people completely underestimate. If you enjoy deep dives that change how you see the future of space, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, get yourself comfortable. Let's begin. On a spring day in 2026, if everything goes to plan, a rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty will rise from Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The road to this moment has not been smooth. A hydrogen leak, a helium flow issue that forced the rocket back to the vehicle assembly building for repairs, and months of delays have tested the program's patience and its hardware, but the teams have polled go. The Space Launch System, the most powerful rocket NASA has ever built, will generate 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, more force than any vehicle in operational service anywhere on Earth. Twin solid rocket boosters, each 177 feet tall, will ignite alongside 4 RS-25 engines, fed by a core stage holding over 700,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The noise will be heard from dozens of miles away. The ground will shake. A column of fire will stretch hundreds of feet beneath the rocket as it climbs away from the same launch complex where Saturn V rockets once carried Apollo astronauts toward the moon. Sitting at the top of this machine, inside a capsule called Orion, will be 4 human beings. NASA astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch, along with Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. Together, they will ride that capsule on a 10-day journey that will carry them around the moon and back to Earth. They will travel roughly 685,000 miles in total. At their farthest point, they will pass approximately 5,000 miles beyond the far side of the moon, potentially setting a new record for the greatest distance any human crew has ever traveled from Earth, surpassing the mark of 248,655 miles set by the Apollo 13 crew in 1970. Whether the record is broken depends on the exact launch day and time. For a brief window, they will be completely alone on the far side, cut off from direct communication with mission control, with nothing but the moon between them and every other human being who has ever lived. And then they will come home. That is the mission. No landing, no surface experiments, no footprints pressed into lunar regolith, no flag planting, no triumphant descent down a ladder. If you are expecting the drama of Apollo 11, the raw survival tension of Apollo 13, or the cinematic grandeur of science fiction, Artemis II will look like an anticlimax, a crude flyby of a destination humanity reached more than half a century ago, executed without even touching down. Some people will hear about this mission, process the words flyby and no landing, and wonder what the point is. We already went to the moon. We already proved we could do it. 6 times, in fact. 12 men walked on the surface. Why spend billions of dollars to send 4 astronauts on a loop around a world we explored decades ago without so much as skimming the dust? That reaction is understandable. It is also profoundly wrong. And understanding why it is wrong requires looking beyond the surface of what Artemis II does and examining, with precision, what it actually proves. Start with the hardware, because the hardware is the story. The Space Launch System is flying for only the 2nd time in its existence. Its maiden flight, the uncrewed Artemis I mission, launched on November 16, 2022, after years of delays, budget overruns, and technical challenges that made it one of the most scrutinized rocket programs in NASA history. That first flight was a success in many critical respects. The SLS performed well through every phase of ascent. The core stage engines burned for the planned duration. The solid rocket boosters separated cleanly. The interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the upper stage responsible for sending Orion toward the Moon, executed its trans-lunar injection burn. Orion reached the Moon, entered a distant retrograde orbit that carried it more than 40,000 miles beyond the lunar surface, spent 25.5 days in space, and returned to Earth with a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on December 11, 2022. By most measures, Artemis I did what it was designed to do. But that mission also revealed a problem that nobody had anticipated, a problem that would consume nearly 2 years of investigation, delay the entire Artemis program, and become the defining technical challenge that Artemis II must now confront. During re-entry, the heat shield on the bottom of the Orion capsule behaved in ways that engineers did not predict. The heat shield is a critical piece of safety hardware. It is 16.5 feet in diameter, the largest heat shield ever built for a crewed spacecraft. It is made of an ablative material called avcoat, the same family of thermal protection material used on the Apollo capsules that brought astronauts home from the Moon in the 1960s and 70s. Avcoat is designed to char and erode in a controlled, predictable manner as the spacecraft slams into Earth's upper atmosphere at speeds approaching 25,000 miles per hour. At those velocities, the air in front of the capsule compresses so violently that temperatures on the heat shield surface reach nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The ablative material absorbs that heat and carries it away as it burns off, keeping the temperature inside the cabin safe for crew. On Artemis I, the avcoat did not erode smoothly. After the capsule was recovered from the Pacific and transported back to Kennedy Space Center, post-flight inspection revealed something disturbing. Chunks of charred material had broken away from the heat shield in more than 100 locations, leaving divots and cavities across its surface. This was not the controlled, even ablation, that decades of testing and modeling had predicted. Something had gone wrong at the fundamental level of how the material responded to the re-entry environment. NASA did not disclose the full extent of the damage immediately. It was not until the NASA Office of Inspector General published a report in May of 2024, complete with photographs of the ravaged heat shield surface, that the public saw the scope of the issue. The images showed pockmarked sections where significant material had been lost, areas where the char layer had cracked and separated, rather than eroding gradually as designed. The investigation that followed was extensive. NASA assembled a multidisciplinary team spanning thermal protection systems, aerothermodynamics, materials science, stress analysis, and non-destructive evaluation. The NASA Engineering and Safety Center provided additional technical expertise. An independent review board was convened. Engineers at the ArcJet complex at NASA's Ames Research Center in California conducted over 100 tests, subjecting avcoat samples to conditions designed to replicate the precise thermal environment Orion experienced during its return from the Moon. The root cause, announced in December 2024, traced back to an interaction between the avcoat material and the skip re-entry technique that Orion uses. Skip re-entry is a maneuver where the spacecraft dips into the upper atmosphere, uses aerodynamic drag to slow down, then skips back out into the fringes of space before plunging in again for final descent and splashdown. This technique gives Orion greater flexibility in targeting its landing zone in the Pacific Ocean, and reduces the peak deceleration forces on the crew. It is the planned re-entry method for all crewed Artemis missions. Here is what happened. During the first atmospheric dip, the outer surface of the avcoat began to heat and ablate as expected. Gases were generated inside the material as part of the normal ablation process. But when Orion skipped back out of the atmosphere and heating rates dropped between the two dips, thermal energy that had accumulated during the first pass continued to propagate inward through the material. The outer layers of the char cooled and began to resolidify, trapping the gases that were still being generated deeper in the heat shield. Because the avcoat lacked sufficient permeability, Those gases could not vent outward through the material as they were supposed to. Pressure built up internally. When the spacecraft dipped into the atmosphere for the second time and external heating resumed, the trapped gases expanded. The result was cracking and mechanical failure of the char layer. Chunks broke free. Material was liberated in an uncontrolled fashion. The investigation team was able to reproduce the phenomenon in ground testing, confirming the mechanism. They also determined why prior testing had not predicted the issue. Before Artemis I, engineers had tested the avcoat extensively in arc jet facilities, but those tests had been conducted at much higher heating rates than the spacecraft actually experienced during the skip phase. At the higher rates, the gases vented through the material before they could accumulate. The problem only manifested at the lower, more gradual heating rates that occurred between the two atmospheric dips, a regime that had not been adequately explored before flight. This finding created an immediate and uncomfortable question. The heat shield for Artemis II was already built. It was already bonded to the Orion capsule. Removing it and building a replacement would have required years of additional delay, potentially pushing the mission into 2028 or beyond. For a program already under intense pressure to demonstrate progress, that kind of delay could have been programmatically fatal. NASA chose a different path. For Artemis II, the agency will modify the re-entry trajectory. Instead of the full skip entry that Artemis I flew, where the capsule bounced off the atmosphere and re-entered a second time, Artemis II will use a steeper, more direct descent that essentially eliminates the skip. The Artemis II flight director described the new profile as a loft rather than a true skip, a trajectory where the capsule may gain slight altitude during re-entry, but never exits the atmosphere entirely. This steeper approach reduces the time the heat shield spends in the temperature range where gases accumulated and became trapped on Artemis I. The trade-off is a shorter downrange distance to splashdown, which constrains where and when the capsule can land and narrows the available launch windows. Thermal analysis shows this modified profile keeps the heat loads within margins that the existing avcoat material can handle safely. Future Orion capsules, starting with the spacecraft being assembled for Artemis III, will incorporate upgraded manufacturing techniques. Specifically, engineers will modify the billet mold loading process, altering how much avcoat is loaded into each mold to produce a more permeable material that allows gases to vent, even during a full skip entry. This addresses the root cause permanently for missions beyond Artemis II, but this is precisely the point. The modified re-entry trajectory has been analysed extensively on the ground. It has been modelled in computers. It has been tested in arc jet facilities. What it has not been is validated under actual flight conditions, at actual lunar return velocities with actual human beings aboard. Artemis II will provide that validation. Every sensor on the heat shield, every thermocouple measuring temperature gradients through the material, every accelerometer recording deceleration profiles, every camera capturing the ablation in real time, all of it will generate data that determines whether the operational mitigation works as predicted. This is not a minor engineering footnote appended to an otherwise routine mission. It is a central reason the mission exists. It is the kind of knowledge that cannot be generated in a laboratory or a supercomputer simulation. You need the real environment, the actual plasma conditions of a capsule screaming through the atmosphere at Mach 25 after falling back from 400,000 miles of deep space. The physics are too complex. The interactions between material properties, gas dynamics, thermal conduction, and aerodynamic forces too intricate to be fully captured by any model. You must fly, you must measure, you must learn, and the heat shield is only one of the systems under examination. Artemis II will be the first time the Orion spacecraft's environmental control and life support systems operate under real human loads. On Artemis I, there were no astronauts aboard to breathe the air, drink the water, generate the carbon dioxide and humidity that the life support systems must continuously manage. The systems ran, but they ran in a configuration that simulated crew presence rather than supporting actual crew. On Artemis II, 4 people will depend on those systems for every breath they take across 10 days in deep space. The carbon dioxide scrubbing system will need to function continuously. The water recovery system will need to process and recycle. Temperature and humidity control will need to maintain a livable cabin environment, while the spacecraft transitions between the extreme thermal conditions of sunlight and shadow in cislunar space. The crew will test manual and automated control of Orion's propulsion system. They will evaluate the spacecraft's star tracker navigation, which uses the positions of known stars to determine orientation and course, a method of celestial navigation that connects the most advanced spacecraft humanity has built to the oldest tradition of human exploration. They will test deep space communication links across the full range of distances they will encounter, including the critical period when Orion passes behind the Moon and temporarily loses direct line of sight contact with Earth. During that communications blackout, the crew will be entirely on their own, relying on onboard systems and their own training to manage any situation that arises. They will also conduct science. The mission carries several experiments designed to study the deep space radiation environment. NASA selected the Atenea satellite from Argentina's National Space Activities Commission, which will study radiation shielding, map the surrounding radiation field, gather GPS data for future mission planning, and test long-distance communication. South Korea's K-RAD Cube will study a dosimeter material designed to mimic human tissue, measuring the biological effects of deep space radiation. Saudi Arabia's Space Weather CubeSat will measure aspects of space weather in high Earth orbit. And the Avatar investigation will use organ-on-a-chip devices to study how increased radiation and microgravity affect human tissue at a cellular level. These experiments are not afterthoughts. Understanding the radiation environment between Earth and the Moon is essential for designing the shielding, operational protocols, and mission durations that will protect crew on longer surface missions. None of this generates the kind of imagery that trends on social media. There will be no bootprint photograph, no Earthrise moment with astronauts standing on another world. The visual record of Artemis II will be a capsule in space, 4 people floating inside it, running checklists, monitoring displays, operating systems. It will look like work. Because it is work. It is the painstaking, methodical, unglamorous work of validating a deep space vehicle system that must perform flawlessly before anyone can be trusted to ride it to the lunar surface and back. Now consider the crew. Reed Wiseman is the mission commander, a former Navy test pilot and NASA astronaut who previously flew to the International Space Station aboard a Soyuz spacecraft. Victor Glover is the pilot, also a Navy test pilot, who served as pilot on the first operational flight of SpaceX's Crew Dragon to the International Space Station. Christina Koch is a mission specialist who holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, having spent 328 consecutive days aboard the International Space Station, during which she participated in the first all-female spacewalk. Jeremy Hansen is a mission specialist from the Canadian Space Agency, a former fighter pilot who was selected as a Canadian astronaut in 2009. When Artemis II flies, Victor Glover will become the first person of colour to travel beyond low Earth orbit and into the lunar vicinity. Christina Koch will become the first woman. Jeremy Hansen will become the first person who is not a citizen of the United States to reach deep space and the neighbourhood of the Moon. These are not symbolic gestures attached to a routine flight. They represent a deliberate and structural expansion of who participates in humanity's deepest ventures into space. Every Apollo crew was composed entirely of white American men. That reflected the era, the institutions, and the selection pipelines of the 1960s. Artemis II reflects a different era, different institutions, and a fundamentally different model of exploration. Hansen's inclusion in particular carries programmatic significance that extends well beyond his individual qualifications. His seat on this mission represents Canada's investment in the Artemis partnership. Canada committed to building the Canadarm3 robotic system for the planned Lunar Gateway Station, a contribution valued at over $2 billion Canadian dollars. In exchange, a Canadian astronaut earns a place on an Artemis mission. This is how international partnerships function in practice. They are not ceremonial arrangements. They are exchanges of capability for access, of technology for participation, of national investment for national presence in an endeavour that no single country can afford or execute alone. The mission profile itself deserves attention for what it reveals about NASA's approach to risk. Artemis II will fly a free return trajectory. After launch and an initial period in Earth orbit to verify spacecraft systems, the crew will commit to the trans-lunar injection burn that sends Orion toward the Moon. From that point, the trajectory is designed so that the Moon's gravity will swing the spacecraft around and send it back toward Earth without requiring any additional major propulsive maneuvers. If a main engine fails after trans-lunar injection, if critical systems degrade, if an emergency arises that prevents the crew from executing planned burns, they are already on a path that brings them home. This is not an accident or a fortunate coincidence. It is a designed-in safety architecture that acknowledges the reality of what this mission is: a test flight. Artemis II is classified as a test flight. Its primary purpose is to evaluate systems, gather data, and verify that the integrated vehicle works as designed under operational conditions. Test flights carry inherent uncertainty because they are, by definition, doing something that has not been done before with the specific hardware in question. The free return trajectory provides a baseline level of crew safety that remains intact even if significant failures occur during the mission. The 10-day timeline unfolds in a carefully sequenced series of phases. After launch, the crew will spend approximately 2 orbits around Earth, using that time to perform a comprehensive checkout of Orion's systems. This is not a passive waiting period. The crew and mission controllers will methodically verify that every critical system is functioning within its expected parameters before committing to the journey to the Moon. Propulsion, life support, navigation, communication, power generation, thermal control, each must be confirmed as operational. If any system shows an anomaly during this checkout phase, the mission has abort options that return the crew to Earth without ever leaving the relative safety of low Earth orbit. The decision to proceed with trans-lunar injection, the burn that sends Orion out of Earth orbit and toward the Moon, is made only after the checkout is complete and all systems are confirmed as ready. The trans-lunar injection burn will then accelerate Orion to the velocity needed to reach lunar distance, approximately 25,000 miles per hour. Within hours of that burn, the crew will pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, 2 concentric zones of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field that extend from roughly 600 miles to more than 36,000 miles above the surface. The inner belt contains high-energy protons. The outer belt contains primarily electrons and heavier ions. Passing through these belts exposes the spacecraft and its crew to elevated radiation levels. Apollo astronauts transited the belts in roughly 30 minutes each way, minimizing their exposure through trajectory design that aimed for the thinnest sections. Artemis II will follow a similar approach, threading a path that limits time in the most intense radiation regions. The onboard radiation experiments will take measurements throughout this transit, providing data that informs shielding design and operational planning for future missions, where crews may spend longer periods at lunar distance. The outbound transit will take roughly 4 days, during which the crew will continue testing systems, conducting experiments, and communicating with mission control. As the distance from Earth increases, the communication delay grows. Near the Moon, radio signals take approximately 1.3 seconds to travel each way. This round-trip delay of roughly 2.6 seconds may sound trivial, but it changes the character of communication between crew and ground. Conversations acquire an unnatural rhythm. Real-time troubleshooting becomes slightly but meaningfully more difficult. For future missions where crews will operate on the surface with even more complex tasks, understanding how this delay affects operational coordination is essential. Artemis II provides the first opportunity to study these dynamics with a crew actually operating at lunar distance. As Orion approaches the Moon, it will execute a powered flyby, using the spacecraft's main engine to shape its trajectory around the far side. The crew will pass within approximately 4,000 to 6,000 miles of the lunar surface at their closest approach, then continue outward to a maximum distance of roughly 5,000 miles beyond the moon's far side. This is the moment when the crew will be farther from Earth than any human beings have ever travelled, roughly 380,000 miles from home, plus an additional 5,000 miles beyond the moon itself. They will see the far side of the moon with their own eyes, a landscape no human has witnessed firsthand since the Apollo era. During the far side passage, Orion will enter a communications blackout that lasts roughly 30 to 40 minutes. The bulk of the moon will block all direct radio contact with Earth. No voice communication, no telemetry, no commands from mission control. The crew will be entirely self-reliant during this window, monitoring their own systems and managing any contingencies using onboard procedures and their training. This blackout period is a critical test of crew autonomy and spacecraft reliability. For future landing missions, crews on the lunar surface will routinely operate without real-time ground support for extended periods. The blackout on Artemis II provides a controlled preview of that operational reality. The return transit will take another 4 days. As Orion approaches Earth, the crew will prepare for the critical re-entry phase. The spacecraft will orient itself with the heat shield facing forward. It will hit the top of the atmosphere at roughly 24,500 miles per hour, generating the extreme temperatures that the heat shield must withstand. The modified re-entry will be executed, and the capsule will decelerate through the atmosphere before deploying its parachutes for splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. 10 days, 685,000 miles, no landing. And yet this mission will answer a question that has haunted NASA for over 2 decades. Can the systems that the agency has been designing, building, testing, debating, defending, redesigning, and assembling since the early 2000s actually carry human beings to the moon and bring them home? Not in a computer simulation, not in a congressional hearing, not in an artist's rendering or a press release or an engineering review. In the real, physical, unforgiving environment of deep space, where the vacuum is absolute, the radiation is constant, the distances are vast, and the margin between success and disaster is measured in material properties and trajectory angles. The last time a human crew flew to the vicinity of the moon was December of 1972. In the intervening 53 years, the United States launched the space shuttle 135 times, never traveling beyond low Earth orbit. It built the International Space Station, an engineering marvel that orbits at an altitude of roughly 250 miles, close enough that astronauts can see individual cities on Earth below. It sent robotic probes to every planet in the solar system and beyond, but it did not send a single human being past the thin shell of space immediately surrounding our planet. 53 years is a long time. It is long enough for the engineers who designed the Saturn V to retire and pass away. Long enough for the flight controllers who guided Apollo missions to leave NASA and write memoirs. Long enough for the industrial base that manufactured lunar-rated hardware to dissolve. Long enough for institutional knowledge, the kind of knowledge that lives in people's heads and hands rather than in documents, to evaporate almost entirely. Rebuilding that capability from a standing start, with new technology, new contractors, new management structures, and new political dynamics, is what the Artemis program has spent 2 decades attempting to do. Artemis II is the moment that attempt produces its first tangible, human-carrying result. If 4 astronauts fly to the moon and come home safely, the United States will possess something it has not had since the last Apollo crew splashed down, a demonstrated, operational, flight-proven capability to send people beyond Earth orbit and return them alive. That capability is the foundation on which everything else in the Artemis program is built. And what is built on it, as the next part of this story will reveal, is far more ambitious and far more strategically consequential than most people realize. The question is no longer whether the United States can reach the moon. The question is whether it can prove that reaching the moon is not a one-time achievement, but the beginning of something permanent. That proof starts with Artemis II, and everything that follows depends on whether it works. On December 14, 1972, astronaut Eugene Cernan stood on the surface of the Moon in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, a landscape carved by ancient volcanic activity and framed by mountains rising thousands of feet above the valley floor. He was the last human being to walk there. Before climbing back into the Apollo 17 lunar module, he spoke a few words about peace and hope for the future. The hatch closed, the ascent engine fired. The small spacecraft rose from the surface, trailing a plume of debris, and humanity left the Moon. Nobody at NASA intended that moment to be the end. Apollo 18 had been planned. So had Apollo 19 and Apollo 20. Hardware for those missions had already been manufactured. Saturn V rockets designated for those flights sat in various stages of readiness. The scientific community had ambitious plans for exploring the lunar highlands, deploying long-duration surface experiments, and establishing a semi-permanent research presence. The Apollo Applications Program envisioned using modified Apollo hardware for extended missions that would push the boundaries of what crews could accomplish on the surface. None of it happened. The cancellations came in waves. Apollo 20 was cut first, then 19, then 18. Each cancellation reflected the same underlying reality. The political conditions that had created Apollo no longer existed. The Soviet Union had lost the race to land a cosmonaut on the Moon. The Cold War urgency that had driven President Kennedy's 1961 commitment to a lunar landing within the decade had been satisfied. Vietnam consumed budgets and political attention. Domestic priorities competed for funding. Public interest in moon missions, once electric, had faded with astonishing speed. By the time of Apollo 17, television networks were reluctant to carry live coverage of lunar surface activities. The audience had moved on. What followed was not merely a pause in lunar exploration, it was a systematic dismantling of the capability to conduct it. The Saturn V production line was shut down. The tooling and manufacturing fixtures were scrapped or repurposed. The facilities at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans that had built the rocket's massive first stage transitioned to other programs. The workforce that had designed, assembled, tested and launched the most powerful rocket ever flown dispersed into other industries or into retirement. The operational procedures, mission rules, flight software and trajectory expertise accumulated across 17 Apollo missions began to decay as the people who held that knowledge left the agency. By the late 1970s, returning to the Moon would have required starting over, not from zero, because the physics had not changed and the engineering principles were well understood, but from a standing start in terms of hardware, manufacturing, workforce training and operational infrastructure. The tooling was gone. The supply chains were gone. The rockets were museum pieces. 3 unused Saturn V rockets ended up on display at Kennedy Space Center, Johnson Space Center, and the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, lying on their sides like monuments to a capability that no longer existed. This is the part of the Apollo story that rarely gets told with sufficient emphasis. Apollo was a triumph of engineering, courage, and national will. It remains one of the greatest achievements in human history. But it was also, in programmatic terms, a dead end. The architecture was designed for a sprint, not a marathon. Each Saturn V cost roughly $1.2 billion in today's money. Each mission consumed an entire rocket. Nothing was reusable. The production rate could not be sustained at the funding levels Congress was willing to provide once the political urgency evaporated. Apollo demonstrated that reaching the Moon was possible. It did not demonstrate that staying there was feasible. The distinction matters enormously, because in the decades that followed, every attempt to return to the Moon ran into the same fundamental problem. The gap between a spectacular one-time achievement and a sustainable ongoing capability is vast, and no amount of nostalgia or ambition can bridge it without sustained institutional commitment and funding. The history of post-Apollo lunar ambitions reads like a catalogue of false starts. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative on the 20th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, calling for a return to the Moon and eventually crewed missions to Mars. NASA responded with a 90-day study that produced an architecture estimated to cost roughly $450 billion over 20 to 30 years. The price tag was politically radioactive. Congress rejected the initiative within 2 years without ever seriously funding it. In 2004, President George W. Bush announced the Vision for Space Exploration, which directed NASA to retire the Space Shuttle, complete the International Space Station, and develop a new set of vehicles, the Ares rockets and the Orion capsule, to return astronauts to the Moon by 2020. This became the Constellation program. It survived for 5 years, producing significant design work on Orion and early development of the Ares I crew launch vehicle. But schedule delays and cost growth plagued the program. An independent review committee in 2009, the Augustine Committee, concluded that Constellation was on an unsustainable trajectory given its budget. The Obama administration cancelled the Ares rockets and redirected NASA toward a flexible path that included asteroid missions as intermediate destinations. Orion survived the cancellation, adapted to a new role atop a new rocket. The Ares vehicles did not. In 2017, Space Policy Directive 1 formally reoriented NASA toward the Moon. The Artemis program took shape around the Space Launch System, the surviving Orion capsule, and a new set of partnerships with commercial companies and international space agencies. This time, the program had structural advantages its predecessors lacked. SLS used Space Shuttle heritage hardware, including the RS-25 engines and solid rocket boosters, which reduced some development risk. Orion had been in development for over a decade and was approaching flight readiness. International partners, particularly the European Space Agency, were deeply integrated into the vehicle design through the European Service Module. Commercial companies were engaged through contracts structured differently from the traditional cost-plus model, but Artemis also inherited a burden that no engineering solution could solve: the credibility deficit created by 50 years of broken promises. Inside NASA, inside Congress, inside the international partner agencies, and among the broader public, there existed a deep and justified skepticism that any American lunar return program would actually follow through. Programs had been announced, programs had been funded, programs had been cancelled. The cycle was so familiar that it had become an assumption. This program, too, would eventually be restructured, delayed, descoped, or killed by a future administration with different priorities. This credibility deficit is not an abstract problem. It has concrete consequences for how the program operates. Congressional appropriators allocate funding year by year, and their willingness to sustain multi-billion-dollar annual investments depends on their confidence that the program will produce results within a politically relevant timeframe. International partners make long-term industrial commitments, building hardware that takes years to develop, based on the assumption that the program will still exist when that hardware is needed. Contractors hire and train workforces, invest in facilities, and develop supply chains. All of these decisions involve risk, and the level of risk each stakeholder is willing to accept correlates directly with how credible they believe the program to be. Artemis I, the uncrewed test flight in 2022, was a necessary step. It demonstrated that the SLS and Orion could function as integrated systems. It proved the rocket could launch, the spacecraft could reach the Moon, and the capsule could survive re-entry. But in the calculus of program credibility, uncrewed flights carry limited weight. Rockets launch, capsules fly. What separates a human spaceflight program from a robotic one is the willingness and ability to put people on the vehicle. Until you do that, you have a launch vehicle program. You do not have a crewed deep space capability. This is the threshold that Artemis II exists to cross. If 4 astronauts fly to the Moon and return safely, the Artemis program will have accomplished something that no NASA initiative has managed since Apollo 17. It will have produced a demonstrated, flight-verified, crew-carrying lunar transportation capability. Not a plan for one, not a schedule toward one, an actual one, proven in the only environment that matters, the real operational conditions of cislunar space. That proof changes the credibility equation in ways that ripple outward through every level of the program's support structure. For Congress, it transforms the program from an expensive initiative that might eventually produce results into a program that has successfully sent Americans to the moon. The political dynamics shift when a program has a visible achievement that constituents can point to. For international partners, it validates the investments they have already made and reduces the perceived risk of committing to future contributions. For the commercial partners developing landing systems and surface hardware, it confirms that the transportation backbone they are building on top of actually works. Understanding why this matters requires examining the revised Artemis architecture that NASA announced on February 27, 2026. The announcement, delivered by NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman at Kennedy Space Center, represented the most significant restructuring of the Artemis program since its inception. Isaacman, a former commercial astronaut who flew on SpaceX's Inspiration 4 and Polaris Dawn missions before being appointed NASA Administrator, described the previous architecture as not a path to success. He cited the unsustainable 3-year gap between SLS launches, the technical delays in developing the Block 1B upgrade for the rocket, and the programmatic risks of attempting a crewed lunar landing without first testing the integrated lander systems in space. The restructuring was comprehensive, and its details reveal how deeply the program's leadership has internalized the lessons of previous failures. The most immediate change affected the SLS rocket itself. NASA announced it would abandon the planned Block 1B and Block 2 configurations, cancelling the exploration upper stage that would have replaced the interim cryogenic propulsion stage on later missions. The exploration upper stage had been in development for years and had accumulated its own schedule delays and cost growth. Its development also required a second mobile launch platform, Mobile Launcher 2, which was itself behind schedule and over budget. Continuing to pursue both the new upper stage and the new launch platform would have extended the gap between missions and added layers of complexity to the transition from early Artemis flights to later ones. Instead, NASA will standardize on a near Block 1 configuration for all future SLS launches. The specific upper stage solution is still being defined, since the interim cryogenic propulsion stage is based on the Delta IV upper stage, which United Launch Alliance no longer manufactures after the final Delta IV heavy launch in April 2024. But the principle is clear: maintain a consistent vehicle configuration that allows a faster launch cadence rather than pursuing a more capable but slower to deliver upgrade. This is a trade-off. The Block 1B with its exploration upper stage would have been able to send heavier payloads to the moon, enabling more ambitious missions. The near Block 1 configuration sends less mass per flight but flies more often. NASA's leadership concluded that frequency matters more than capability per launch at this stage of the program. A rocket that flies every 10 months and builds operational experience is more valuable than a theoretically more powerful rocket that sits in development for years, while the workforce loses proficiency and the program loses political momentum. The industrial implications of standardization are significant. Boeing, the prime contractor for the SLS core stage, endorsed the revised approach, stating that its workforce and supply chain were prepared to meet the increased production demands. Lockheed Martin, the Orion prime contractor, similarly expressed support. For these companies, a faster launch cadence means more predictable revenue, more stable employment, and more efficient use of manufacturing facilities. The multi-year gaps between flights under the previous plan created boom and bust cycles, where surge hiring for one mission was followed by workforce reductions during the processing lull, followed by another surge of hiring as the next mission approached. Each cycle lost experienced workers and required expensive retraining. A 10-month cadence smooths out those cycles and preserves the human capital that makes the program function. The funding mechanism for this accelerated cadence also received a significant boost. In July 2025, President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which included $10 billion for NASA programs. Of that total, $4.1 billion was designated for the production of SLS rockets for Artemis IV and Artemis V, and $2.6 billion for the Lunar Gateway space station, with additional funding directed toward a Mars telecommunications orbiter and other initiatives. This was not routine appropriations funding. It was a supplemental allocation that provided multi-year stability for the program's most expensive elements. The political significance of this funding is considerable. It represents a bipartisan commitment to Artemis that extends the program's financial foundation beyond the annual budget cycle that has killed previous initiatives. The second major change in the revised architecture affected the mission sequence. Under the previous plan, Artemis III was designated as the first crewed lunar landing, with a target of 2027. The crew would launch in Orion, rendezvous with SpaceX's Starship human landing system in lunar orbit, transfer to Starship, descend to the surface, conduct operations, return to Orion, and fly home. This plan required an unprecedented number of first-time operations to succeed on a single mission. First crewed SLS and Orion flight to lunar orbit with landing intent. First crewed use of Starship. First Orion Starship docking. First crewed lunar landing in over 50 years. First use of the new Axiom Space extravehicular activity suits on the surface. And first crew return from the lunar surface using the Starship ascent capability. The revised plan inserts a new mission between Artemis II and the first landing attempt. The new Artemis III, targeted for mid-2027, will be a systems integration test conducted in low Earth orbit. An Orion spacecraft will launch, rendezvous and dock with one or both commercial human landing systems from SpaceX and Blue Origin, and conduct integrated testing of docking interfaces, life support systems, communications, propulsion, and the Axiom Space Lunar Extravehicular Activity Suits. NASA explicitly described this mission as analogous to Apollo 9, the March 1969 flight that was the first crewed test of the Apollo lunar module. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module's propulsion, life support, and docking systems in the relative safety of Earth orbit before Apollo 10 rehearsed the full landing profile in lunar orbit, and Apollo 11 attempted the actual landing. The parallel is instructive and worth examining in detail. During the Apollo program, NASA did not attempt a lunar landing until the fourth crewed mission of the program. Apollo 7 tested the command module in Earth orbit in October 1968, verifying that the Block 2 spacecraft was safe for crew after the Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts during a launch pad test in January 1967. Apollo 8 flew to lunar orbit in December 1968, demonstrating that the Saturn V could send a crewed spacecraft to the Moon, and that the navigation and communication systems worked at lunar distance. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit in March 1969, with astronauts undocking, flying the lunar module independently, testing its descent and ascent engines, and redocking with the command module. Apollo 10 rehearsed the entire landing profile in lunar orbit in May 1969, with the lunar module descending to within approximately 50,000 feet of the surface before the crew fired the ascent engine and returned to the command module. Only after all 4 of these incremental steps had been successfully completed did NASA commit to the Apollo 11 landing attempt in July 1969. Each mission accepted specific risks, validated specific systems, and generated specific data that reduced uncertainty for the mission that followed. The program moved quickly, 4 crewed missions in 9 months, but it did not skip steps. Each step was a prerequisite for the next. The revised Artemis architecture applies the same incremental logic. Artemis II proves the crewed transportation system. Artemis III proves the integrated lander and docking systems. Artemis IV commits to the landing. The difference is that Artemis also must integrate systems from multiple commercial providers and international partners, adding complexity that Apollo did not face. This makes the system's integration test on Artemis III even more critical. The Orion spacecraft, the European Service Module, the SpaceX or Blue Origin lander, the Axiom spacesuits, and the mission control infrastructure must all function together as a coherent system. Testing that integration in low Earth orbit, where an abort to Earth is measured in hours rather than days, is a fundamentally different risk proposition than testing it for the first time in lunar orbit, where the crew is 4 days from home. Under this revised sequence, the first crewed lunar landing is now designated Artemis IV, targeted for early 2028. The crew would launch in Orion, travel to lunar orbit, transfer to whichever commercial lander has been validated through Artemis III, and any additional testing, descend to the surface near the lunar South Pole, conduct approximately 1 week of surface operations, and return to Orion for the journey home. Artemis V would follow by late 2028, and NASA plans at least 1 crewed surface mission per year after that. The selection of which commercial lander carries astronauts to the surface on Artemis IV will be determined by which provider has demonstrated readiness through the Artemis III test and any supplementary development flights. This competitive dynamic, where 2 providers are developing landers and the one that proves ready first earns the first landing mission, creates an incentive structure that did not exist in Apollo's sole source contracting model. This is an ambitious cadence. 1 SLS launch roughly every 10 months. Annual lunar surface missions building toward a permanent base. Progressive deployment of surface infrastructure, habitats, power systems, resource utilization experiments, communication relays. The long-term vision includes extracting water ice from permanently shadowed craters near the South Pole and converting it into oxygen for breathing and hydrogen and oxygen for rocket propellant. If achievable, this would fundamentally change the economics of deep space exploration by reducing the mass that must be launched from Earth for each mission. But every element of this architecture depends on the foundational proof that Artemis II provides. The new Artemis III systems test cannot fly unless Orion has been proven safe for crew. The Artemis IV landing cannot be attempted unless the Orion lander docking systems have been validated on Artemis III, which cannot happen unless Orion itself has been validated on Artemis II. The annual cadence cannot be established unless the SLS and Orion production and processing pipeline is functioning, which requires confidence derived from successful missions. Each mission in the sequence is a prerequisite for the next. Remove the first one, and the chain collapses. This is why framing Artemis II as just a flyby fundamentally misunderstands what the mission represents within the program's architecture. A flyby is what the mission does. What the mission is, within the context of the Artemis campaign, is a proof of system demonstration that unlocks every subsequent step. It is the keystone in an arch that cannot stand without it. The revised architecture also reveals something important about how NASA's current leadership thinks about the challenge of sustained lunar presence. Administrator Isaacman's remarks at the February announcement emphasized urgency, credibility, and competition. He described the previous architecture as unsustainable because of the long gaps between missions and the compounding technical risks of attempting too much on a single flight. He explicitly cited competition from what he called our greatest geopolitical adversary as a factor motivating the accelerated cadence, and he emphasized that the path forward must be evolutionary, building capability mission by mission rather than betting everything on a single high-risk attempt. This philosophy of evolutionary development stands in sharp contrast to the approach that killed previous lunar return programs. Those programs failed, in part, because they were designed as monolithic efforts that required everything to work simultaneously. New rockets, new capsules, new landers, new surface systems, all developed in parallel and brought together for a single culminating mission years in the future. When any single element fell behind schedule or exceeded its budget, the entire program's timeline slipped. When timelines slipped far enough, political support eroded. When support eroded, budgets were cut. When budgets were cut, timelines slipped further. The death spiral was familiar enough that it had become almost predictable. The revised Artemis architecture attempts to break this cycle by creating a series of near-term milestones that each deliver tangible results. Artemis II delivers the first crewed lunar flight in 53 years. Artemis III delivers the first integrated test of the landing system. Artemis IV delivers the first landing. Each milestone provides a visible achievement that justifies continued investment and sustains political support. The faster cadence means that each administration, regardless of party, will see Artemis missions during its term. This makes the program harder to cancel, because cancellation would mean visibly abandoning a program that is actively flying and producing results. But the strategy only works if the first milestone is achieved. If Artemis II does not fly, or if it encounters problems that require an extended stand-down, the sequence of near-term achievements never materializes. The program reverts to the familiar pattern of promises about future results, and the credibility deficit that has haunted lunar ambitions for 50 years reasserts itself. There is another dimension to the relationship between Artemis II and the revised architecture that deserves attention. The practical reality of maintaining a launch vehicle workforce and industrial base across multi-year gaps between flights. The 3.5-year gap between the Artemis I launch in November 2022 and the Artemis II launch, now targeted for April 2026, was driven by multiple factors. The heat shield investigation, upgrades to Orion's life support systems, and the time required to process and stack a second SLS vehicle. But a contributing factor was the low production rate and the corrosive effects that long intervals between flights have on every element of the system. When you only fly a rocket once every 3 or 4 years, every component ages on the shelf. Batteries have certified shelf lives and must be replaced if the vehicle sits too long. Pyrotechnic devices, the explosive bolts and separation mechanisms that enable stage separation and abort scenarios, have shelf life limitations that require inspection and potential replacement. Seals and gaskets in propellant systems degrade over time. Avionics and flight computers may require software updates as the ground systems they interface with evolve during the processing interval. The vehicle that eventually sits on the launch pad is not precisely the vehicle that was originally assembled, because time itself introduces new variables that must be managed through inspection, testing, and component replacement. The helium flow issue that forced a rollback of the Artemis II stack from the launch pad to the vehicle assembly building in late February 2026 illustrates this dynamic concretely. On February 21st, 2 days after a successful second wet dress rehearsal, engineers detected an interrupted flow of helium to the rocket's interim cryogenic propulsion stage. The helium system pressurizes fuel tanks and is critical for engine ignition and operation. Investigation revealed that a seal in the helium flow path needed replacement. In addition to the helium problem, batteries across the rocket's upper stage, core stage, and solid rocket boosters needed replacement because the extended processing timeline had pushed them beyond their certified service life. The flight termination system, which allows range safety officers to destroy the rocket if it veers off course during launch, required end-to-end retesting after the battery swap. These are not exotic failures or design flaws. They are the mundane, predictable consequences of a vehicle system that operates at an insufficient flight rate. Flying more frequently solves this problem directly. A rocket that launches every 10 months spends less time aging on the ground. Components are installed and flow through the system before they approach shelf life constraints. The workforce maintains hands-on proficiency because they are actively processing vehicles rather than waiting years between surges of activity. Procedures stay fresh. Muscle memory remains intact. The institutional rhythm of a flight program, the cadence of stacking, testing, rolling out, rehearsing, and launching, becomes routine rather than exceptional. Manufacturing lines stay warm. Suppliers maintain production rates. The entire industrial ecosystem that supports the program operates in a steady state rather than cycling between dormancy and frantic reactivation. This is not theoretical. It is the lesson of every successful operational launch system in history. The space shuttle maintained a workforce and a processing pipeline, by flying multiple missions per year. SpaceX's Falcon 9 has achieved its remarkable reliability and cost reduction by flying at a rate that now approaches 100 launches annually. The more you fly, the better you get at flying. The less you fly, the more problems accumulate between flights, and the more each flight becomes a special event requiring heroic effort rather than a routine execution of practice procedures. Artemis II is the mission that either validates or undermines the argument for faster cadence. If it succeeds, the case for flying more often gains its most powerful piece of evidence: a successful crewed flight that demonstrates the baseline system works and should be exercised regularly. If it encounters significant problems, the counter-argument gains strength. The system is not yet mature enough for increased cadence and needs more development time, which means longer gaps, which means more shelf life issues, which means more problems discovered during processing, which means further delays. The feedback loop runs in both directions, and which direction it runs depends on what happens in April. The difference between touching the moon once and going back to stay is not primarily a difference in technology. The physics that carried Apollo 11 to the Sea of Tranquility in 1969 are the same physics that will carry Artemis missions to the lunar South Pole. The difference is institutional. It is programmatic. It is political. It is the difference between a sprint and a sustained effort, between a singular achievement and an operational cadence, between proving something is possible and proving it is repeatable. Apollo proved that reaching the moon was possible. Then the capability was deliberately abandoned because the institutional and political framework that created it could not sustain it. The 53-year gap between Cernun's last steps in Taurus Littrow and the Artemis II crew's journey around the far side is not a gap in knowledge or technology. It is a gap in commitment, in follow-through, in the willingness to convert a spectacular demonstration into a durable program. Artemis II does not close that gap by itself. No single mission can. But it takes the first concrete step toward proving that this time the commitment is real, that the hardware works, that the architecture can support a sustained campaign, and that the cycle of announcement, delay, and cancellation that defined half a century of lunar ambitions has finally been broken. What happens after that step, and why it matters not just for NASA but for the emerging strategic competition around the moon, is where this story takes its most consequential turn. In June of 2025, at the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center in northwestern China, the crew module of a spacecraft called Mengzhou launched away from its pad on a column of fire. It was not heading to space. It was heading sideways, accelerating horizontally at enormous force before arcing upward and deploying its parachutes for a controlled descent into the desert. This was a pad abort test, a demonstration that the escape system designed to save astronauts in the event of a launch failure could actually pull the crew module free of a malfunctioning rocket and bring its occupants to safety. The test was successful. The crew module separated cleanly, flew a ballistic trajectory, deployed its parachutes, and landed intact under airbag cushioning in the arid terrain of northwest China. Most people outside the space industry never heard about it. There was no global press conference, no countdown broadcast, no viral social media moment. The test appeared as a brief item on the China Manned Space Agency's official channels and was covered in specialized aerospace publications. But within the community of people who track human spaceflight development, the implications were immediately understood. China had just validated a critical safety system for the spacecraft that will carry its astronauts to the moon. The escape system is one of those components that you hope never needs to activate in flight, but whose successful demonstration is a prerequisite for committing human lives to the vehicle. By testing it successfully, China cleared another gate on the path toward a crewed lunar mission before the end of this decade. That pad abort test was one milestone in a sequence that has been accelerating. In August 2025, the Lanyue lunar lander completed a comprehensive landing and takeoff verification test at a dedicated testing facility in Hebei province. The test validated the lander's descent engines, guidance algorithms, structural integrity, and the integrated performance of its major systems under conditions designed to simulate the lunar environment. Earlier in 2025, China conducted static fire tests of a shortened first-stage test article for the Long March 10, the heavy-lift rocket being developed specifically for crewed lunar missions, and the first 7. In February 2026, a low-altitude demonstration and validation flight of the Long March 10 launch vehicle system took place at the Wenchang Space Launch Site on Hainan Island, testing the vehicle's propulsion and control systems during powered flight. Each of these events represents real hardware operating under real physical conditions. Not renderings, not timelines, not budget projections, engines firing, structures bearing load, systems integrating, and each one brings China closer to its publicly stated objective: landing Chinese astronauts on the moon before 2030. The Chinese crewed lunar architecture is built around 3 primary systems, each of which has now entered the testing phase. Mengzhou is the crew spacecraft, designed in a modular configuration with a crew capsule and a service module. The capsule can carry up to 6 astronauts in its low Earth orbit configuration and is designed for reuse, with a replaceable outer heat shield and an airbag landing system that allows recovery in desert terrain rather than at sea. A deep space variant of Mengzhou will support lunar missions. The first uncrewed orbital test of Mengzhou is planned for 2026, launched atop the Long March 10 rocket. Lanyu is the dedicated lunar lander. It weighs approximately 26 metric tons and can carry 2 astronauts to the lunar surface. The lander consists of 2 sections: a propulsion stage that carries fuel for the descent and separates during the final phases of touchdown, and a landing stage that houses the crew during surface operations and supports their return to lunar orbit. The lander's design has been publicly presented by the China Manned Space Agency on multiple occasions, and its development timeline includes a robotic prototype test, scheduled for 2027 or 2028, followed by an uncrewed integrated Mengzhou Lanyue demonstration mission planned for 2028 or 2029. If those tests succeed, a crewed lunar landing would follow approximately 1 year later, placing a potential first Chinese crewed landing around 2029 or 2030. The Long March 10 is the heavy-lift rocket that makes all of this possible. It is a new vehicle, not an evolution of existing Chinese launch systems. It uses kerosene and liquid oxygen propellant in its first stage, a departure from the hypergolic fuels used in many earlier Chinese rockets. Its lifting capacity is designed to place approximately 70 metric tons into low Earth orbit in its lunar mission configuration. The crewed lunar mission profile requires 2 Long March 10 launches, one to send Mengzhou into orbit and another to send Lanyue. The 2 vehicles would then rendezvous and dock in lunar orbit, with 2 astronauts transferring from Mengzhou to Lanyue for the descent to the surface, while 2 crew members remain in orbit. What distinguishes the Chinese program from the half-century of American lunar ambitions that preceded Artemis is not its technology, which draws on proven engineering principles, but its institutional continuity. China's human spaceflight program traces its origins to Project 921, a comprehensive long-term plan approved by the Chinese Communist Party in 1992. The plan laid out a phased development pathway. First, master the fundamentals of crewed spaceflight. Second, develop rendezvous and docking capability and establish a space laboratory. Third, build and operate a permanent space station. Each phase built on the previous one. Each was funded, executed, and completed largely on schedule. China launched its first astronaut, Yang Liwei, in October 2003 aboard Shenzhou 5. It conducted its first 2-person mission in 2005. A 3-person crew flew in 2008, during which China performed its first spacewalk. The Tiangong 1 and Tiangong 2 space laboratories followed, testing life support, docking, and habitation technologies. The full Tiangong space station began assembly in 2021 and became fully operational in 2022. China now maintains a permanent crewed presence in low Earth orbit, with regular crew rotations every 6 months. In 2025, the Shenzhou 20 mission set new duration records, and one astronaut on the upcoming Shenzhou 23 crew is planned to spend more than a year in orbit, a deliberate step toward understanding the physiological challenges of long-duration spaceflight that will be relevant to lunar surface missions. The crewed lunar landing program is the next phase. It follows the same pattern: methodical development, step-by-step testing, incremental build-up of capability. China has consistently denied that its lunar ambitions constitute a race with the United States. In a narrow sense, this may be accurate. China is not reacting to American timelines. It is executing its own plan. But whether or not the Chinese government frames this as competition, the strategic dynamics of two major spacefaring nations simultaneously developing crewed lunar capabilities create competitive pressures that shape both programs. The United States government has been explicit about recognizing these pressures. At the February 2026 announcement of the revised Artemis architecture, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman stated directly that the program faced credible competition from our greatest geopolitical adversary. This was not diplomatic hedging. It was a public acknowledgement that the pace of China's lunar development factored into NASA's decision to accelerate its mission cadence, add a systems test flight, and pursue annual surface missions rather than accepting the multi-year gaps between flights that had characterized the previous plan. Former NASA Associate Administrator Mike Gold articulated the stakes at a United States Senate hearing when he stated that the countries that arrive at the moon first will write the rules of the road for what humanity can do there. This framing captures a dimension of the competition that transcends national prestige. The moon is not merely a destination for scientific exploration. It is a domain where questions of resource access, territorial norms, operational standards, and governance frameworks will be established by the nations that demonstrate the capability and willingness to operate there. Two competing frameworks for lunar governance are already taking shape. The Artemis Accords, introduced by the United States in 2020, establish a set of principles for how nations participating in the Artemis program will conduct lunar exploration. The Accords address transparency of operations, interoperability of systems, registration of space objects, the release of scientific data, preservation of heritage sites, extraction and use of space resources, and the avoidance of harmful interference between missions. As of 2026, over 40 nations have signed the Accords. They represent a normative framework rooted in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, but extended to address practical questions that the treaty's drafters could not have anticipated, particularly around resource utilization. China and Russia have assembled an alternative coalition around the International Lunar Research Station, a joint project announced in 2021 that envisions a shared lunar base with contributions from multiple nations. The International Lunar Research Station Cooperation Organization includes China, Russia, South Africa, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and other member states. The project has a different governance model, different operational assumptions, and reflects different strategic interests than the Artemis framework. It represents a parallel pathway to lunar presence, one that does not depend on American participation or align with American-led norms. The strength and durability of each framework depends directly on the credibility of the nation leading it. If the United States demonstrates that it can send astronauts to the moon, validate its hardware, and build towards sustained presence, the Artemis Accords gain weight as a practical governance structure backed by an operational program. Partner nations see tangible benefits to participation: access to technology, opportunities for their astronauts, involvement in lunar surface operations, and a voice in shaping the norms that will govern this new domain. If the program stalls, those same nations face a different calculus. They must weigh the value of aligning with a framework whose leading nation has not yet delivered on its commitments against the potential benefits of engaging with a Chinese program that may reach the moon on a more predictable timeline. This dynamic is already playing out in concrete ways. Consider the European Space Agency's role in Artemis. ESA provides the European service module for the Orion spacecraft. This is not a peripheral contribution. The service module generates electrical power through solar arrays, provides propulsion for orbital maneuvers, stores water, oxygen, and nitrogen for the crew, and manages thermal regulation. Without the European service module, Orion cannot function. Airbus Defence and Space builds the module under contract to ESA, and the production line in Bremen, Germany, is already assembling service modules for Artemis III and beyond. This represents a multi-billion euro industrial commitment by European governments, backed by years of engineering development and workforce investment. A successful Artemis II validates this investment. European stakeholders, from space agency officials to industrial leaders to parliamentary budget committees, can point to a concrete result that justifies the expenditure. The hardware they built flew to the moon with a crew aboard and brought them home safely. That is a fundamentally different political conversation than defending continued investment in a program that has only conducted one uncrewed test flight. Canada's investment follows a similar logic. The Canadian Space Agency committed to building Canadarm3, the next-generation robotic system for the Lunar Gateway Station, as its primary contribution to the Artemis partnership. The commitment is valued at over $2 billion Canadian dollars and represents one of the largest space investments in Canadian history. In return, Canadian astronauts earn seats on Artemis missions. Jeremy Hansen's place on Artemis II is the first tangible delivery on that arrangement. If the mission succeeds, the partnership is validated at the most visible level possible. A Canadian has flown to the moon on an American spacecraft powered by a European service module. The coalition is not theoretical, it is operational. Japan's contribution to the Artemis program extends even further into the surface mission architecture than many people realize. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency has committed to providing life support components, batteries, and other critical technology for the Lunar Gateway Station. But Japan's most ambitious contribution is a pressurized lunar rover being developed in partnership with Toyota. This vehicle is designed to allow astronauts to travel across the lunar surface for extended distances, potentially hundreds of kilometers, without wearing spacesuits. The rover would function as a mobile habitat, with its own life support, power generation, and communication systems. Astronauts would live and work inside the pressurized cabin during traverses lasting days or weeks, venturing outside in suits only to conduct specific surface activities. The pressurized rover addresses a fundamental limitation of Apollo-era surface exploration. Apollo astronauts were confined to walking distance from their landing site on early missions and to the range of an unpressurized electric rover on later ones. Their maximum traverse distance was roughly 35 kilometers on Apollo 17. A pressurized rover would extend that range by an order of magnitude, transforming the scope of what crewed lunar missions can accomplish. It would allow crews to access permanently shadowed craters, distant geological features, and resource deposits that are beyond practical reach of any fixed-base architecture. Toyota's involvement brings automotive manufacturing expertise, battery technology, and thermal management systems that the aerospace industry does not traditionally possess. But Japan's willingness to invest billions of yen in a lunar rover that will not be needed until the late 2020s or early 2030s depends on confidence that the Artemis program will deliver the missions that require it. If Artemis stalls, the rover becomes hardware without a ride. Japan's investment calculus is directly tied to the credibility of the program's execution timeline, and that credibility traces back to whether Artemis II demonstrates that the core transportation system works. The same logic applies across the broader coalition. Australia has signed the Artemis Accords and is developing contributions in areas including lunar communications and resource characterization. Italy has committed to providing habitation modules and surface systems. The United Kingdom, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, India, and dozens of other nations have signed the Accords and are exploring their own roles. Each signatory has domestic reasons for joining: access to technology transfer, opportunities for their scientific communities, diplomatic alignment with the United States, or industrial development goals. But each one also has domestic constituencies that will question the investment if the program does not deliver visible results. A successful Artemis II does not just validate American capability, it validates the coalition model itself, proving that a multinational program coordinated around shared principles and distributed contributions can produce operational results in deep space. Now consider the same dynamic from the perspective of the commercial partners. The Artemis architecture integrates commercial companies at a depth that Apollo never approached, and that has no parallel in the Chinese program. SpaceX holds a contract to develop the Starship human landing system for Artemis missions. Blue Origin holds a contract to develop the Blue Moon Mark II lander as a second provider. Axiom Space is developing the next-generation extravehicular activity suits that astronauts will wear during lunar surface operations. These contracts are structured as fixed-price, milestone-based agreements, meaning the companies bear financial risk if they fall behind schedule or exceed costs. This is a deliberate departure from the cost-plus contracts that characterized earlier NASA programs, where the government absorbed overruns and contractors had limited incentive to control costs. The development status of both commercial landers is relevant to understanding the stakes surrounding Artemis II. SpaceX's Starship program has conducted a series of increasingly ambitious test flights from its Starbase facility in South Texas. The vehicle is the largest and most powerful rocket ever built, standing approximately 120 meters tall and generating roughly 17 million pounds of thrust at liftoff from its array of Raptor engines. Through 2024 and 2025, SpaceX conducted multiple integrated flight tests, progressively demonstrating stage separation, upper stage orbital insertion, propellant management, engine relighting in space, and booster recovery. The program has experienced both spectacular failures and rapid recovery, consistent with SpaceX's iterative design philosophy of testing aggressively, accepting failures early, and incorporating lessons into subsequent hardware on a compressed timeline. However, the Starship human landing system variant that NASA requires for Artemis surface missions is substantially different from the standard Starship configuration. The lunar lander variant must be capable of landing vertically on the Moon using its Raptor engines, supporting crew habitation on the surface and ascending back to lunar orbit for rendezvous with Orion. It requires a different propulsion configuration, a human-rated life support system, a crew airlock for surface operations, and the ability to receive multiple propellant transfer operations in Earth orbit before departing for the Moon. Each of these capabilities must be demonstrated before a crewed landing can be attempted. The Artemis III systems integration test in low Earth orbit is specifically designed to begin validating some of these operations. Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark II lander represents a different architectural approach. The lander is smaller than Starship and uses a more conventional design with a descent stage and an ascent stage. Blue Origin selected the BE-7 engine, which burns liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen for the lander's propulsion. The company has been developing the lander under its Sustaining Lunar Development contract with NASA, which was awarded in 2023 as a second source provider to ensure that the Artemis program is not dependent on a single landing system. Blue Origin's New Glenn heavy lift rocket, which completed its first launch in 2025, provides the company's own pathway for placing Blue Moon components into orbit. The existence of two competing lander providers creates redundancy and competitive pressure that strengthens the overall architecture. If one provider encounters development delays or technical problems, the other can potentially fill the gap. The revised Artemis III mission, the systems integration test in low Earth orbit, may involve docking with one or both landers, providing NASA with data on both systems before committing to either for the first surface mission. This competitive structure did not exist in Apollo, where each major system had a single contractor. It is a deliberate design choice that leverages the commercial space ecosystem that has developed over the past 2 decades. But both commercial lander programs depend on the same foundational assumption, that the Orion spacecraft and SLS rocket can deliver crew to the rendezvous point where the landers will be waiting. That assumption is validated by Artemis II. If the crewed transportation backbone does not work, neither lander has a crew to carry to the surface. The billions of dollars invested by SpaceX, Blue Origin, Axiom Space, and their respective supply chains rest on the same foundation that Artemis II is designed to prove. The commercial government model is uniquely American. China's space program is state-directed. Its hardware is built by government entities and state-owned enterprises. Its astronauts are military officers selected through a centralized process. Its missions are planned and executed through a command structure that reports to the Central Military Commission and the State Council. This model offers advantages in terms of centralized decision-making, long-term planning, stability, and immunity from the commercial market pressures that can affect private companies. But it does not generate the competitive dynamics, private investment leverage, or distributed industrial innovation that the American model produces. A successful Artemis II validates not just the SLS and Orion, but the programmatic model that surrounds them. It demonstrates that the combination of government-built deep space systems and commercially provided landing and surface hardware can produce results. That validation matters because the alternative, relying solely on government systems developed at government pace, has already proven unsustainable over the past 5 decades. There is an additional strategic dimension that is often underappreciated in discussions of the moon race: the role of operational tempo. China's human spaceflight program has established a regular cadence of crewed missions to the Tiangong space station, with launches approximately every 6 months. This rhythm creates institutional proficiency. Launch teams stay trained, mission control stays sharp, manufacturing lines stay active, supply chains remain engaged. The workforce maintains the skills and experience needed to support crewed operations because they are exercising those skills continuously. NASA has not had an equivalent operational cadence for deep space missions. The gap between Artemis I in November 2022 and Artemis II in April 2026 is approximately 3.5 years. During that interval, the SLS and Orion workforce has been processing a single vehicle through a pipeline that was designed for a much higher flight rate. The skills, procedures, and institutional knowledge required to launch crewed deep space missions have not been exercised at flight tempo. The helium flow issue, the hydrogen leak during the first wet dress rehearsal, the extended battery replacement timelines, these are partly consequences of a system that has been sitting rather than flying. The revised Artemis architecture directly addresses this by targeting one SLS launch approximately every 10 months. If achieved, this cadence would keep the workforce engaged, the manufacturing lines active, and the operational infrastructure exercised. But achieving that cadence requires first demonstrating that the current system works well enough to fly more often. Artemis II is that demonstration. Its success makes the argument for faster tempo. Its failure strengthens the argument for longer gaps and more ground testing, which paradoxically increases the risk of the very problems that longer gaps create. When the International Space Station is retired, currently projected for approximately 2030, the strategic balance shifts further. At that point, China's Tiangong will be the only permanently crewed orbital outpost. The International Space Station currently serves as a platform for research, technology development, international cooperation, and continuous human presence in space. Its retirement will leave a gap in Western orbital capability that commercial stations from Axiom Space, Blue Origin, and others are intended to fill, but those stations are still in development. If the retirement occurs before commercial alternatives are ready, there will be a period when the only nation maintaining a continuous human presence in space is China. This context makes Artemis even more strategically significant. If the International Space Station retires, and the Artemis program is not delivering regular crewed missions beyond low Earth orbit, the United States faces a scenario in which China has both a permanent space station and an advancing crewed lunar program, while the American human spaceflight enterprise is in a transition period between the International Space Station and whatever comes next. Artemis missions to the moon would provide a visible, high-profile demonstration of American spacefaring capability, even as the low Earth orbit landscape shifts. China's robotic lunar program adds another layer to this picture. While the crewed program develops, China's uncrewed exploration continues advancing. The Chang'e 7 mission, planned for launch in 2026, will survey the lunar south pole with an orbiter, a lander, and a mini-flying probe, focusing specifically on characterizing water ice deposits and testing technologies critical for sustained human activity. Chang'e 8, expected around 2028 or 2029, will test in-situ resource utilization technologies, TVE, including a three-dimensional printing experiment using lunar soil, laying the technical foundation for the International Lunar Research Station. These robotic precursor missions serve the same function that NASA's robotic missions serve for Artemis. They reduce risk and generate knowledge that enables future crewed operations. But they also establish Chinese presence and operational experience at the lunar South Pole, the same region that Artemis missions are targeting. The first nation to characterize the resource environment at the South Pole in detail gains an informational advantage that shapes the planning of all subsequent missions. None of this means that Artemis II is a geopolitical weapon or that its primary purpose is strategic competition. Its primary purpose is to test spacecraft systems and validate the crewed transportation capability that enables everything else in the program. But the mission exists within a strategic context that amplifies its significance far beyond the engineering data it collects. A crewed flight to the moon is not just a test flight. In the current international environment, it is a statement of intent backed by demonstrated capability. The Chinese program has not yet produced an equivalent statement. Its hardware is impressive and its testing milestones are real, but no Chinese lunar vehicle has flown in space in its crewed configuration. The Long March 10 has not launched to orbit. Mengzhou has not orbited in its lunar variant. Lanyu has not operated in the space environment. Each of these systems must fly, must work, and must be proven before a crewed landing can be attempted. China's program is on track, but it is still several years and several critical tests away from demonstrating the integrated capability that a crewed lunar mission requires. Artemis II, if successful, will establish the United States as the first nation in the 21st century to demonstrate a crewed deep space transportation capability. It will validate the international coalition that has been assembled around the Artemis framework. It will prove that the commercial government partnership model can produce results at the most demanding level of human spaceflight. And it will do so at a moment when the strategic environment makes the demonstration of these capabilities more consequential than at any time since the original space race. The competition around the moon is not a sprint to see who plants a flag first. Flags were planted in the 1960s and 70s, and they did not lead to sustained presence. The competition is about which nation or coalition of nations builds the infrastructure, establishes the norms, and demonstrates the operational capability to remain on the moon over the long term. That competition is won through credibility, and credibility is built one successful mission at a time. Artemis II is the mission that begins building that credibility in earnest. It does so the only way credibility can be built in spaceflight: by flying, by putting crew aboard a vehicle, sending them to deep space, and bringing them home with the data that certifies the next mission. The strategic consequences of that proof will be felt not just in Washington and Beijing, but in every capital where decisions about lunar participation, resource governance, and space partnerships are being made, and those consequences will shape what comes next. There is a concept in complex project management called the critical path. It is the longest sequence of dependent tasks that determines the minimum time a project can take to reach completion. Every task on the critical path must finish before the next one can begin. If any single task on the critical path slips, the entire project slips by the same amount. You can pour resources into tasks that are not on the critical path, and it will not make the project finish any sooner. Only the critical path matters for the timeline. Only the critical path determines whether the project delivers on schedule or falls behind. Artemis II sits on the critical path of the most ambitious exploration program humanity has undertaken since the Apollo era. It is not one task among many. It is the task that gates every other task. The entire downstream sequence of Artemis missions, from the systems integration test in low Earth orbit to the first crewed landing to the establishment of annual surface missions to the eventual construction of a lunar base, cannot begin advancing until Artemis II has demonstrated that the foundational transportation system works with human beings aboard. Remove this mission from the sequence, delay it by years, or see it encounter a significant failure, and the cascade is immediate. Every milestone that follows shifts, every timeline recalculates. Every commitment made by partners, contractors, and governments enters a period of uncertainty. Begin with the most immediate consequence of success. A successful Artemis II produces something that did not exist before the mission launched: operational flight data from a crewed deep space vehicle. This is not the same as ground test data. It is not the same as computational modeling. It is not the same as the data from an uncrewed mission where the spacecraft flew a different trajectory, carried no biological life support load, and returned along a re-entry profile that will never be repeated because it caused the heat shield problem that required modification. Artemis II flight data will show, with direct measurement, how Orion's thermal protection system performs during the modified steeper re-entry with crew aboard. It will show how the life support systems handle the carbon dioxide output, humidity and thermal loads generated by 4 human beings over 10 days. It will show how the navigation systems perform during the communication blackout behind the moon. It will show how the propulsion system executes the powered flyby maneuver that shapes the trajectory around the far side. Every sensor reading, every temperature measurement, every pressure trace, every communication latency metric becomes a data point that feeds into the flight readiness assessment for the next mission. Without that data, the next mission cannot be certified for flight. This is not bureaucratic caution. It is the fundamental logic of incremental flight testing. Each mission generates knowledge that reduces uncertainty for the mission that follows. The data from Artemis I, despite the heat shield anomaly, enabled the design of the modified re-entry profile for Artemis II. The data from Artemis II will enable the certification of Orion for the more complex Artemis III mission, where the spacecraft must not only fly to and from the moon, but also execute rendezvous and docking operations with a commercial lander in low Earth orbit. The systems must be proven in progressively more demanding contexts. You cannot skip steps in this process any more than you can build the 3rd floor of a building without first constructing the 2nd. The Artemis III systems integration test, targeted for mid-2027, depends on Artemis II in a direct technical sense. As described earlier, that mission will validate the integrated lander and docking systems that must work before a landing can be attempted. That certification comes from Artemis II. If the Orion environmental control system reveals an issue during the 10-day mission, that issue must be understood and resolved before the spacecraft carries crew again. If the thermal protection system behaves outside its predicted margins, the implications for the next flight must be assessed. If any critical system performs below specification, the data drives a decision about what needs to change before the next mission can proceed. Beyond Artemis III, the first crewed lunar landing on Artemis IV is targeted for early 2028. That mission will send astronauts to the lunar South Pole region, where they will spend approximately 1 week on the surface conducting science, testing equipment, and beginning the work of characterizing the environment for longer duration habitation. Artemis V would follow by late 2028, and the program's stated goal is at least 1 crewed surface mission per year thereafter, building toward a permanent base. The scope of what those surface missions are intended to accomplish goes well beyond planting flags and collecting rocks. The lunar South Pole was selected as the primary exploration target for a specific and strategic reason that connects directly to the long-term viability of sustained human presence beyond Earth. Near the moon's South Pole, the geometry of sunlight and shadow creates conditions found nowhere else on the lunar surface. Because the moon's rotational axis is tilted only about 1.5 degrees relative to the plane of its orbit, Crater rims near the poles receive nearly continuous sunlight, while the floors of those same craters remain in permanent shadow. Some of these permanently shadowed regions have not seen a single photon of direct sunlight in over 2 billion years. Temperatures in these perpetual freezers never rise above -150 degrees Celsius, cold enough to trap and preserve volatile compounds that would instantly sublimate in the heat of the sunlit surface. Water ice is the most significant of these trapped volatiles. Orbital measurements from multiple missions have detected signatures consistent with water ice in permanently shadowed craters near the South Pole. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has been mapping the Moon in extraordinary detail since 2009, identified reflectance patterns consistent with surface ice deposits using its ultraviolet spectrometer. India's Chandrayaan-1 mission detected hydroxyl and water molecules on the lunar surface using its Moon Mineralogy Mapper instrument. The Lunar Crater Observation and Sensing Satellite, which NASA deliberately crashed into the permanently shadowed Cabeus crater in 2009, detected water vapor and ice particles in the debris plume, confirming that water ice exists in at least some south polar craters. But critical uncertainties remain. The orbital measurements tell us that water ice signatures exist. They do not tell us how much ice is present in any given location. They do not tell us how deep beneath the surface it is buried. They do not tell us whether it exists as discrete chunks of relatively pure ice, as thin frost layers coating regolith grains, or as molecules trapped within the crystalline structure of minerals. They do not tell us how tightly it is mixed with the surrounding soil, or how much energy would be required to extract it in usable quantities. These are not academic questions. They are the engineering questions that determine whether lunar water ice is a curiosity or a resource, whether it is scientifically interesting or economically transformative. Ground truth is needed. Instruments placed on the surface, operated either by robots or by astronauts, that can drill into the regolith, analyze the composition of subsurface layers, measure the concentration and physical state of any ice present, and test extraction methods under actual lunar conditions. This is work that can only be done at the South Pole by missions that can land precisely in the vicinity of permanently shadowed craters while maintaining access to the nearly continuous sunlight available on nearby crater rims for power generation. It is work that requires sustained access, not a single visit, because characterizing a resource deposit requires measurements at multiple locations, at multiple depths, across multiple geological contexts. These are not purely scientific questions. They are economic and strategic questions of the highest order. Water ice on the Moon can be split into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis. Oxygen is breathable. Hydrogen and oxygen together make rocket propellant. If water ice can be extracted and processed on the lunar surface in sufficient quantities, the economics of every mission beyond the Moon change fundamentally. Instead of launching every kilogram of propellant from the bottom of Earth's deep gravity well at enormous cost per kilogram, future missions could refuel at the Moon. A spacecraft departing from lunar orbit for Mars carries its propellant at a fraction of the energy cost of departing from Earth's surface. The Moon becomes not just a destination but a logistics node, a waypoint that reduces the cost and increases the feasibility of reaching deeper destinations. This vision has been discussed for decades. It has appeared in countless NASA studies, academic papers, and strategic roadmaps. What has been missing is the operational capability to actually test it. You cannot determine whether lunar water ice is extractable in useful quantities without sending people and equipment to the locations where it might exist. You cannot send people and equipment without a proven transportation system. You cannot prove the transportation system without flying it with crew. The chain of dependencies runs all the way back to Artemis II. The governance implications are equally concrete. The Artemis Accords establish that nations participating in the program may extract and use space resources, including water, minerals, and other materials found on the Moon. This principle is grounded in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies but does not explicitly address the extraction and use of resources. The Accords interpret the treaty as permitting resource utilization, analogous to how international law permits fishing in international waters without claiming sovereignty over the ocean itself. This interpretation is not universally accepted. Russia and China have raised objections, arguing that the Accord's framework could enable a form of de facto territorial control, even without formal sovereignty claims. The International Lunar Research Station framework operates under different assumptions about resource governance, though the specifics remain less developed than the Accord's provisions. The question of which normative framework ultimately governs lunar resource utilization will be shaped by which nations are actually present on the Moon and conducting operations there. Legal frameworks gain practical authority when they are backed by operational reality. A set of principles signed by 40 nations, but unsupported by any actual lunar surface operations, is diplomatically interesting but operationally inert. A set of principles backed by regular crewed missions, resource extraction experiments, and infrastructure deployment becomes the de facto standard. Artemis II does not establish that standard by itself, but it is the first operational proof that the program capable of establishing that standard is real and functioning. Every successful mission that follows builds the case. Every year of sustained operations strengthens the normative weight of the framework. The alternative, a program that announces principles but fails to demonstrate the capability to act on them, cedes normative authority to whichever program does demonstrate that capability. Now consider the consequences of failure. Not catastrophic failure. Not loss of crew, which remains an extraordinarily low probability event given the extensive safety measures and abort options designed into the mission. Consider instead a significant anomaly. A heat shield performance outside predicted margins that requires an extended investigation. A life support system issue that demands redesign before the next crewed flight. A propulsion problem that raises questions about the Orion service module's deep space reliability. Any of these would be technically manageable. Engineers would investigate. Root causes would be identified. Solutions would be developed. The program would eventually proceed. But eventually is the operative word, and in the context of strategic competition, eventually can be devastating. The gap between Artemis I and Artemis II has already been 3.5 years. If Artemis II encounters a problem that requires another multi-year investigation, the gap between Artemis II and the next crewed flight could stretch to 2029 or beyond. At that point, China's crewed lunar program would likely have completed its first integrated test missions. The Long March 10 would have flown. Mengzhou would have orbited. The Lanue lander would have demonstrated its capabilities. China could be within a year of attempting its first crewed lunar landing, while the United States is still resolving issues from its second Artemis mission. The perception shift in that scenario would be profound. International partners who signed the Artemis Accords based on the expectation of an active American lunar program would face pressure to reassess. Congressional support for multi-billion-dollar annual investments in a program that has flown twice in 7 years would be difficult to sustain. The narrative would shift from NASA is returning to the Moon to NASA is struggling to return to the Moon. And that narrative, once established, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. This is not speculation. It is the same pattern that killed Constellation, the Space Exploration Initiative, and every other post-Apollo lunar return effort. The only way to break the cycle is to produce results faster than doubt can accumulate. That is what the accelerated Artemis cadence is designed to do, and the cadence begins with Artemis II. There is a deeper dimension to what Artemis II represents that goes beyond schedule dependencies and strategic positioning. It concerns the nature of institutional capability itself, and the difference between possessing the knowledge to do something and possessing the demonstrated ability to do it. The United States possesses the knowledge to send humans to the Moon. That knowledge has existed continuously since the Apollo era, refined by decades of additional research in spaceflight engineering, materials science, orbital mechanics, and human factors. The theoretical and engineering foundations for crewed lunar missions are well established. What the United States has not possessed since 1972 is the demonstrated ability to act on that knowledge. The gap between knowing how and showing that you can is not a trivial distinction. It is the gap between a nation that has the theoretical capacity to do something extraordinary and a nation that has actually done it within the lifetimes of its current leaders, engineers, and citizens. Institutional capability is not a permanent asset. It is a living thing that must be exercised to be maintained. The skills required to plan, prepare, launch, and execute a crewed deep space mission exist in people, in teams, in organizational processes, and in the operational culture of the institutions that conduct them. These skills atrophy without practice. The engineers who designed the Saturn V are gone. The flight controllers who managed Apollo missions are gone. The operational knowledge they carried died with them or was captured only partially in documentation. Rebuilding that capability has required training new generations of engineers, developing new operational procedures, conducting new ground tests, and eventually flying new missions. Artemis. I began the process of rebuilding operational flight experience. It exercised the launch team, the mission control team, the recovery team, and the engineering support teams across a full mission cycle. But it was an uncrewed flight, and the operational demands of a crewed mission are categorically different. Crewed missions involve real-time life support monitoring, crew health management, voice communication loops between astronauts and ground controllers, contingency planning for medical emergencies, and decision-making processes that account for human factors in a way that robotic missions do not require. The muscle memory for crewed deep space operations does not exist in any institution on Earth today. It existed at NASA in the 1960s and 70s. It evaporated during the decades when no one flew beyond low Earth orbit. It must be rebuilt, and the only way to rebuild it is to fly. Artemis II is the mission that begins rebuilding that operational muscle memory. Every procedure the flight controllers execute, every checklist the crew follows, every contingency the team manages, every communication protocol they exercise across lunar distances becomes institutional knowledge that enables the next mission to be conducted more confidently, more efficiently, and more safely. This is not romantic language about the spirit of exploration. It is a practical observation about how complex organizations maintain the ability to execute difficult tasks. You must do the task to maintain the ability to do it. You cannot preserve crewed deep space operational capability through documentation and simulation alone, any more than a surgeon can maintain surgical skill solely through reading textbooks. The 4 astronauts aboard Artemis II will bring their own institutional contribution back to the program. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen will spend 10 days operating a deep space vehicle under conditions that no active astronaut has experienced. Their observations, their feedback, their identification of what works and what needs improvement, their assessment of how the vehicle handles, how the interfaces function, how the operational timeline flows, all of this becomes an irreplaceable resource for the teams planning every subsequent mission. Astronaut feedback drove critical improvements throughout the Apollo program. It will drive improvements through Artemis as well, but only if astronauts fly. There is a final element that gives Artemis II its full weight, and it concerns the nature of the moment in which this mission occurs. The 21st century competition around the moon is fundamentally different from the 20th century space race. The original race was a bilateral contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, driven primarily by ideological rivalry and nuclear-era strategic posturing. It ended when one side achieved the symbolic goal of landing first, and the loser effectively withdrew from the competition. The current competition is more complex, more multilateral, and more consequential in its long-term implications. It involves not just 2 superpowers, but a growing community of spacefaring nations, commercial entities, and international organizations. The stakes are not primarily symbolic. They involve practical questions about who controls access to lunar resources, who sets the technical standards for lunar infrastructure, who establishes the governance norms for surface operations, and who benefits economically from the exploitation of a new domain. These are questions that will be answered not by a single dramatic landing, but by the sustained presence and operational capability that a nation or coalition demonstrates over decades. In this context, the country that wins is not the country that arrives first. It is the country that proves it can keep going back. Apollo demonstrated this truth through its negative example. The United States arrived first and then left, and the capability to return dissolved within a few years. The landing was a triumph. The departure was a strategic error whose consequences took 50 years to manifest and may take decades more to fully recover from. Artemis II is the beginning of the recovery, not the completion of it, not even the halfway point. It is the first proof that the recovery is real, that the hardware works, that the systems can sustain crew, that the transportation backbone of a sustained lunar program functions as designed. It is the moment when the Artemis program transitions from a collection of plans, schedules, contracts, and architectural diagrams into an operational reality with human beings at its center. Every claim about lunar bases, resource extraction, annual surface missions, and long-term habitation is, as of today, aspirational. These are things the program intends to do. They are things the architecture is designed to support. They are things the budget is allocated toward. But they have not been done. The distance between aspiration and execution is not measured in miles or dollars. It is measured in demonstrated capability. You cannot claim to have a sustained lunar program until you have sustained it. You cannot claim operational capability until you have operated. You cannot claim credibility until you have delivered. Artemis II delivers the first installment. One crewed mission, flown successfully to the moon and back, with data that certifies the vehicle for the next flight. That single delivery changes the status of everything that follows. The Artemis III systems test moves from planned to next. The Artemis IV landing moves from aspirational to approaching. The annual cadence moves from proposed to in preparation. Each step remains challenging. Each step carries its own risks and uncertainties. But the foundational question, whether the core transportation system works, has been answered. The moon race of the 21st century will not be decided by a single spectacular moment. There will be no equivalent of the Apollo 11 landing, no single mission after which one side can declare victory and the other concedes defeat. The race will be decided by sustained execution over years and decades, by the accumulation of missions flown, systems tested, infrastructure deployed, and partnerships maintained, by the slow, unglamorous, relentless conversion of plans into operations and ambitions into results. That conversion begins with Artemis II, 4 astronauts, 10 days, a loop around the moon with no landing, no surface operations, no flag ceremony. Watched from a distance, it will look like less than Apollo. Understood in context, it is the mission that determines whether everything NASA has built over the past 2 decades actually works well enough to fly people into deep space and bring them home. It is the mission that activates the international coalition assembled around the Artemis Accords. It is the mission that validates the commercial government partnership model. It is the mission that begins rebuilding the institutional capability to operate beyond low Earth orbit. And it is the mission whose success or failure will shape the strategic landscape of lunar exploration for the next decade. The moon does not care who visits it. It has orbited Earth for 4.5 billion years in silence, indifferent to the ambitions of the small creatures on the planet below. But those creatures care. They care because the moon represents something beyond its physical reality, a test of whether a nation, a coalition, a species can commit to something difficult and sustain that commitment long enough to achieve it. Apollo showed that we could reach the moon. It did not show that we could stay. More than half a century of absence demonstrated, more powerfully than any single mission could, that reaching a destination means nothing if the capability to return is not preserved. Artemis II is the first step toward proving that this time will be different, not through promises, not through plans, through execution, through 4 people flying a spacecraft to the moon, testing its systems under the most demanding conditions available, and returning with the data that enables every mission that follows. The strategic consequence of that flight will not be measured in the days after splashdown. It will be measured in the years that follow, in the missions that launch because Artemis II succeeded, in the infrastructure that gets built because the transportation backbone was proven, in the partnerships that deepen because commitments were kept, and in the norms that take root because the program that proposed them demonstrated the capability to enforce them. Artemis II does not land on the moon. It does something more important. It proves that landing on the moon is no longer just a plan. It is the next step in a sequence that has already begun. And in a competition defined not by who arrives first, but by who proves they can keep coming back, that proof is the most strategically consequential achievement the program can deliver.